What if I told you that the strongest position you think you can build, the one with the highest walls, the deepest moats, the most impenetrable defenses, is actually the position most likely to destroy you? Every empire that has ever fallen made the same fatal mistake. Every business that has ever collapsed committed the same strategic sin, and every person who has ever lost everything they worked to build fell victim to the same psychological trap. They built fortresses when they should have built bridges. This is Law 9 from Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, but it's also a fundamental truth about how power actually works in the real world. The moment you isolate yourself behind walls of protection, you've already begun the process of your own destruction. Not because the walls aren't strong enough, but because isolation breeds the very weaknesses that will ultimately kill you, and you won't see them coming until it's far too late. Here's what most people get catastrophically wrong about security and power. They think that protection means separation. They believe that if they can just build high enough walls, accumulate enough resources, surround themselves with enough defenses, they'll be safe from the chaos of the world. But what they're actually doing is creating a prison where they're both the warden and the prisoner, slowly suffocating on their own stagnant air. Let me paint you a picture of the most powerful man who ever lived making this exact mistake. His name was Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, and he built the most magnificent fortress in human history, not made of stone, but of protocol, ceremony, and absolute isolation from his subjects. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a golden cage that separated the king from the very people whose loyalty kept him in power. While Louis lived in splendid isolation, revolution was brewing in the streets of Paris, and he had no idea because his fortress had made him blind to reality. The psychology here is brutal and inescapable. When you isolate yourself, you lose access to the most valuable resource in existence: information. Not the sanitized, filtered information that sycophants feed to people in power, but real, raw, honest intelligence about what's actually happening in the world. And in a universe where information is everything, blindness is death. But this goes deeper than just information. Isolation creates a psychological phenomenon that researchers call confirmation bias amplification. When you only interact with people who agree with you, who depend on you, who tell you what you want to hear, your perception of reality becomes increasingly distorted. You start believing your own propaganda. You lose the ability to recognize threats, adapt to changes, or even understand when your strategies are failing. Think about this in modern terms. How many business leaders have you seen who surrounded themselves with yes men, built corporate cultures that filtered out bad news, and then acted shocked when their companies collapsed? How many wealthy individuals have you observed who isolated themselves in gated communities, exclusive clubs, and private schools, only to raise children who are completely unprepared for the real world? How many people have you watched build social media echo chambers that make them incapable of understanding anyone who thinks differently? The fortress mentality is seductive because it feels safe in the short term. When you're behind walls, you can control your immediate environment. You can eliminate disagreement, criticism, and uncertainty. But what you're actually doing is creating artificial stability in a naturally dynamic world, and artificial stability always collapses eventually. Here's where the ancient wisdom becomes incredibly practical. The Chinese strategist Lao Tzu wrote that the soft overcomes the hard, the weak overcomes the strong. He wasn't promoting weakness. He was recognizing that flexibility defeats rigidity every time. Water doesn't build fortresses. It flows around obstacles, finds every crack, and eventually wears down the hardest stone. That's your model for sustainable power. The most successful people in history understood this instinctively. They didn't isolate themselves. They infiltrated everything. They built networks, not walls. They created influence webs that stretched across social classes, industries, and even enemy territories. When threats emerged, they didn't retreat behind defenses. They had allies embedded everywhere who warned them early and helped them adapt. Consider how this plays out in modern wealth building. The amateur entrepreneur tries to protect their business idea by keeping it secret, filing patents, building legal moats. The professional entrepreneur shares their idea with everyone, incorporates feedback, builds a community of supporters before they even launch. Which approach creates more sustainable success? The evidence is overwhelming. Openness and connection win almost every time. But here's the dark psychology aspect that makes this law so powerful. When you isolate yourself, you don't just lose information, you lose influence. Power isn't what you can do in isolation, it's what you can convince other people to do on your behalf. And you can't influence people you don't interact with. The person behind the fortress might feel powerful, but they're actually becoming increasingly irrelevant with each day of isolation. This is why every dictator eventually falls. They start by eliminating enemies, then critics, then anyone who might pose a threat. Eventually, they're surrounded only by people who are too terrified to tell them the truth. By the time revolution comes, they're the last to know because they've systematically destroyed every channel of honest communication. The same pattern plays out in corporations, relationships, and personal development. The CEO who isolates themselves in the executive suite loses touch with both employees and customers. The wealthy individual who only socializes with other wealthy people loses understanding of the market forces that created their wealth. The expert who only talks to other experts in their field misses the paradigm shifts that make their expertise obsolete. Here's your strategic alternative. Instead of building fortresses, build what I call influence networks. These are relationships that span multiple levels of society, multiple industries, multiple perspectives. You want allies in high places and friends in low places. You want access to boardrooms and bar rooms, to academic conferences and street corners. Diversity of connection equals diversity of information, and diversity of information equals adaptive advantage. But this isn't just about networking. It's about psychological positioning. The person who builds fortresses operates from fear and scarcity. They're trying to protect what they have. The person who builds networks operates from confidence and abundance. They're positioning themselves to gain from whatever changes come. Here's the practical implementation that will transform your approach to power and security. First, audit your current isolation patterns. Where have you built walls that are actually limiting your growth? What information sources have you cut off? What relationships have you sacrificed for the illusion of security? Second, practice strategic vulnerability. This doesn't mean oversharing or being naive about threats. It means being selectively open with people who can provide value, feedback, or different perspectives. The goal isn't to eliminate all boundaries. It's to ensure your boundaries are permeable enough to let valuable information flow through. Third, develop what I call embedded allies, relationships with people at different levels of every system you operate in. If you're building a business, you want connections with customers, suppliers, competitors, regulators, and industry observers. If you're climbing a corporate ladder, you want allies above you, beside you, and below you in the hierarchy. Fourth, master the art of strategic accessibility. Make yourself available to people who can teach you something, challenge your assumptions, or provide early warning about changes in your environment. But do it selectively, with purpose, not randomly. Here's the advanced psychological technique that separates masters from amateurs. Learn to use apparent vulnerability as actual strength. When people see that you're confident enough to be accessible, when they observe that you don't need walls to feel secure, they perceive you as more powerful, not less. Confidence is magnetic. Paranoia is repulsive. The Stoics understood this perfectly. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the Roman Empire, made himself available to citizens during regular public audiences. He didn't see this as a security risk. He saw it as a strategic advantage. Direct contact with his subjects gave him information that no amount of reports from advisors could provide. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of this law is understanding that in our hyper-connected world, fortresses are not just ineffective, they're impossible. Information flows too quickly, markets change too rapidly, public opinion shifts too suddenly. The person who tries to control their environment through isolation will find that the environment changes around them faster than they can adapt. Your security doesn't come from what you can hide behind. It comes from how quickly you can adapt to change. Your power doesn't come from what you can control. It comes from your ability to influence what you can't control. Your wealth doesn't come from what you can protect. It comes from your capacity to create value in whatever new world emerges. Stop building walls that make you blind. Start building bridges that make you informed. The future belongs not to those who can hide from change, but to those who can dance with it. And you can't dance if you're locked behind fortress walls, no matter how strong you think they are. Your greatest strength isn't your ability to exclude the world. It's your ability to engage with it more skillfully than anyone else.